As many of you have been watching my channel for a while know, Prey from Arcane Studios is one of my favorite games of all time, and in my opinion, its DLC Mooncrash is quite literally the most underrated game content ever that almost no one's played. So when that same studio announced to the world that they would be working on a new IP set in a vampire wasteland, including multiplayer and immersive sim elements from titles we loved before, I was instantly sold. But you see, because Prey didn't do well commercially along with a lot of internal issues, the most important people from that project ended up leaving to found a new company before this new vampire game Redfall even saw the light of day. And well, when it finally did get released, it broke my heart. A studio that I at one point considered my favorite in the entire industry, making games with a design and worlds that spoke so specifically to me that while niche were so much better than anything out there, released one of the worst titles of the year. You see, on the surface, Redfall actually has a good setup. You play as a handful of survivors who find themselves on an island inhabited by paranormal super vampires and their loyal followers. And it's your job, along with any friends so you choose, to fight and loot your way through the entire island as you uncover the story as to what's really going on. It should have in many ways been a home run, a Masquerade the Bloodline style vampire immersive sim with looter-shooter elements combining the awesome strategy of immersive simulation games, all while playing with friends. The world is beautiful, full of great sound design, and certain parts of the story were even awesome. But none of that mattered because at its core, Redfall was an unfinished, uninspired mess, and an obvious warning sign that a studio that had just before crafted one of the greatest games of all time has faltered so much. It's funny too because Redfall honestly isn't as bad as most people say. If you play it for yourself, some of the ambiance and environments are breathtaking, and the setting is really interesting to just run around in. But the second you start trying to go on missions or engage in combat with some of the most brain-dead AI imaginable, it all just falls apart. On top of that too, many of the powers and skills in the game, while fine, don't reach the same heights of design from things like blinking in Dishonored or mimicking matter in Prey to turn into a coffee cup to get into hard-to-reach places. And also, the level design is just leagues below what it's been before from Arcane. Honestly, it feels like a watered-down version of the style of game that made Arcane such a pivotal studio before. And on top of that, the characters in game are so cringy and awkward, it's hard to even play without muting them half the time with their strange and nonsensical one-liners. The thing that makes this game so heartbreaking though is that under all of these mistakes is a soul to a game that could have been great. Snippets of brilliance that harken back to the feelings you would get playing Arcane games before, like engaging stealth levels or environments filled to the brim with dark and foreboding lore. You can feel that somewhere in here is the game we all wanted, the game Arcane fans were begging for, and the reason Redfall's release had so many people talking about how Arcane never misses. And it's just so sad to see, because this studio made so many amazing, underrated games for so long, with so much innovation, and yet when finally everyone was talking about them and how great they were, when the hype was finally reaching its crescendo and it was time for Arcane to shine, they dropped the ball so hard, along with so many at the studio being gone by this point. It's truly heartbreaking knowing that such a talented team of developers that synergized so well and really gave it their all never got the full recognition they deserved before things started falling apart. Imagine if Baldur's Gate 3, for example, never got the recognition this year it deserved and then caused Larian to suffer, making their next game only a shadow of the former. Well, that's what happened to Arcane Austin. I'm telling you, for any of you who haven't played Prey, that game is on the level of a Baldur's Gate 3, but just in a different genre, and it never got the recognition it deserved. And especially its DLC Prey Mooncrash is beyond underrated. But despite all of that, the true mark of a studio and what they're made of is how they bounce back, how they respond in the face of adversity. And I hope more than anything that the developers at Arcane Austin take this mistake in stride and learn with a fire in their hearts to show the world that they still have what it takes to make some of the greatest and most interesting games out there, but only time will tell. In a year like this one, full of so many amazing games, there are bound to be some that fall through the cracks. Games that in another year or time would have made a bigger splash and found more hype, but sadly didn't quite find the sizable audience they really deserve. And in this case, I think the most underrated game of many in 2023 would have to be Remnant II. You see, I've always liked looter shooters, whether it be Borderlands, Destiny, Outriders, or Warframe, but if I'm being frank, I always seem to grow bored of them rather quickly. Without a big group to play with that is constantly on, they lose a lot of what makes them special. And while that's certainly also the case for Remnant II, the ways in which it does mix things up and the methodologies to difficulty and bosses make it such a breath of fresh air. Usually looter shooters feel like such easy and thus boring games, where enemies are easy to kill and avoid, and bosses are just giant bullet sponges that test patience more than skill. In Remnant 2 though, everything is designed more like Dark Souls but with guns, where even some smaller enemies can kill you quickly, and many of the bosses have full in-depth mechanics that take time to learn and master, especially on the harder difficulties. For me, it adds to what this genre was really missing, an actual sense of challenge that makes every moment more tense and interesting. And on top of that, the world itself is so beautiful and well crafted, with tidbits and lore about each location that are fascinating despite an otherwise forgettable main story. At the core of it all too is what's always most important about games like this, the combat. And here Remnant 2 once again shines, allowing you to spec into many different types of builds that rely on things like dodging, casting spells, weapon special abilities, being tanky with armor, or even becoming a superhero shooting lightning out of your fingertips. There's so many different guns, mods, and builds in this game, and because everyone can multi-class between all of the available playstyles, there's tons of depth in the build variety, and it's only further exemplified in groups. For example, my first character I built to summon things to fight for me while also healing everything around me. So I would run around the battlefield setting off chaos, all while healing from all the damage I was taking. It was great. And once again, the key behind it all is the difficulty. For almost all of the classes in game, for example, you don't just get to choose them from a UI and go. You have to search through each environment, solve puzzles, discover secrets, and defeat giant great monsters if you want the best things. And in Remnant 2, this can literally be entire classes or playstyles that you accidentally stumble upon in a secret passageway most players might miss. Actual challenge and intrigue like this do make the experience a lot more hardcore than say something like Destiny 2, but I think that honestly is for the better, because it also makes all of your accomplishments matter that much more. And it also means when playing in multiplayer with random people, players will often help each other find things that others missed, because then everyone gets to unlock extra power they didn't know about before, and it makes the whole community feel more fun, inviting, and thriving. Overall, it really is just such a fantastic game, and one I genuinely can't believe hasn't gotten more love from across the gaming landscape. It's a shame too, because it's the exact breath of fresh air the genre needed, and feels amazing and fun to play with super meaty combat, real challenge, and great sound design, along with a really good score. Even in a year full of so many amazing titles to try, Remnant 2 still stands near the top of that list as a game that many people would love, but lots haven't even heard about. Sometimes though, a game can do the opposite, and instead have a potential that has so much going for it, and a game that is good, but also fails to capitalize on everything it could offer. And for 2023, that game for sure is Lethal Company. It's a small indie project made by one guy where you get to play with up to 3 friends as space haulers that have to go to different planets to grab things to meet a quota, which unlocks new planets, more money to buy cool gear, and new things to do. The premise is super basic, but because of the creepy atmosphere and monsters, the game went absolutely viral at the end of the year on TikTok and caused a massive wave of players to rush to the title to enjoy and make memories. And even despite the low polygon graphics and janky animations, the game has such a unique sense of heart to it that, especially for the first couple of hours, makes it so fun to play. Things like in-game proximity chat where you can faintly hear your partner screaming in the distance, or walkie-talkies that allow for one space captain to sit in the ship and talk to companions inside a zone surrounded by monsters as he leads them through it all, make the game so uniquely interesting. But sadly, after those first couple of hours or days playing the game, it starts to get a lot more stale. Every planet looks almost the same, the interiors are copy-pasted rooms endlessly, and the monsters lose their sense of edge once you've seen them so many times. It's hard to fault the developer though, since it's just one guy who was making something to use on his resume, but still, the core of this game and its ideas are so awesome and fun that it almost makes me wish there was a bigger team here that could make more content and provide more polish. The tactile nature of the gameplay is so special, where you have to do things like actually type on the keyboards in order to loot, being able to move containers around the ship to troll friends, or switching the lights on and off. It's such a great setup for what could be a game that provides endless hours of fun, but because it's so shallow after that initial excitement wears off, it quickly fades away. In some ways, it reminds me of games like Fall Guys or Among Us that had a big blow up and then faded away a little more after, but this time with even less content. The reason I find this example a lot more interesting though is I think the core game design and concepts here have a lot more staying power than either of those previous other two titles, and if there was say tons of more planets with lots of new gadgets and monsters, along with meta progression systems to always give us a carrot on a stick, this game could have a staying power that Fall Guys and Among Us never did. And that's why I think Lethal Company is the game with the most unrealized potential, one that while it is already wildly successful and fun, could have been so much more and reached even greater heights had it been realized completely on initial release. But once again, I can't fault the creator at all for this. The game could have just as easily been ignored and all the extra effort would have meant lost time and crippling debt to pay for contractors. My only fear is that the big budget version of this game that will inevitably come out eventually might not capture the same magic this game did when playing it for the first time with friends. One of the most interesting things for me about this year though was just how much I agreed with everyone. Whether that be the masses finally thinking Cyberpunk 2077 was amazing, Baldur's Gate 3 being Game of the Year, or Starfield missing the mark, I actually tended to find myself on the same side as most gamers for once. Which is strange because one of the main reasons I started this channel in the first place was because I had so many opinions about games in this industry I felt really strongly about that I saw no one else voicing. But don't worry, I have one of those for this year too. And that's for a game that didn't even come out this year, but one I finally got around to playing for the first time, Disco Elysium. It's a title that is regarded by many as one of, if not the best RPG of all time, and tells the story of a drunken man waking up and solving a murder that turns into a story about life, politics, and the human psyche. It's actually one of the best written games of all time without a doubt, and you would think for someone like me who's a sucker for great writing, that would mean I would be in love. But sadly, it couldn't be any further from the truth. From the moment the game started, I just felt bored, honestly. And this isn't from one playthrough. It's from now 3 where I have forced myself over and over again to try and understand why people love this game so much, and without fail, each time I played this year, I couldn't ever feel the magic. And that's because what on the surface is great writing with super interesting leveling systems where you quite literally dive into the inner subconscious of your character as you learn more about them, becomes mundane and uninteresting to me because I just didn't connect with the setting of Redfall and the new world at all. I personally find this satire on the Paris communes inspired by Karl Marx to just be boring. The streets are so full of people with amazing writing and questions about humanity and society's struggle against capitalism and socialism alike, but I just didn't really enjoy talking to anyone at all. Everyone's analogies are almost too abstract. The narrator and how he speaks feels like the game is taking itself too seriously even in moments of absurdity. The skill system and how it feels so pretentious trying to obfuscate simple mechanics. In other games similar to this, I tended to like having to pull back the nature of the writing and systems to understand everything that was going on. Like say for example Planescape Torment, a game that I think is really amazing and is very similar to this one. But in Disco Elysium, when I level up a Screep de Corpse at the start, I get that it changes my relationship towards cops in the game, which plays a big role, and I do like that too much or too little of any one of these skills can have drastic effects on the world and change what happens in conversations, where your mind might take over and ruin a skill check because, for example, you can't control your encyclopedia upgrade, meaning you can't stop thinking about everything you know. I really do adore this system in principle, and it's really cool and allows for a lot of emergent storytelling, but it just feels like the game's writing always wants to be one step ahead of you even when it's not. Sometimes making things more clear and simple can be better too. On top of this as well, the main story is so slow for me, and the reveals almost never were exciting in my opinion, meaning the most interesting parts of the game were about the scab and dock worker union struggles and the philosophical questions they asked. But even there, the writing is just so obscured that I had trouble thinking about all the interesting questions the game was posing without feeling like I was listening to a lecture from a pretentious university professor who thought their high IQ and affinity to the Communist Manifesto meant everyone in the world needed to hear their voice. Even having said all that though, I can see how for some, this game is so beloved, and there were certain quests on my journey that were fantastic. Like one where you get to investigate a haunting near a store and climb all the way to the top floor to uncover what's really going on, with a lot of commentary on modern society along the way. But I'd be lying if I said I was engaged the whole way through. Most of the time time I was simply sitting at my screen not only bored, but rolling my eyes at a good amount of the dialogue that felt obscured for the sake of obscurity itself. Most of all though, I think the reason I love something like say Planescape Torment but have trouble here is because the setting of Planescape Torment was so much more interesting to me, and Revachol fell flat in so many ways. I didn't like the annoying characters like Kuno, I didn't care about the politics or love stories, and overall, it just isn't a game for me. And that doesn't mean in any way it's a bad game at all. More so, I was just surprised to find that I disliked it so much. I thought I would really love it. But often with games like this, you have to be in the right mood to play them, and maybe this just wasn't the year for that. So let me know down below for those of you that do love this game, because I know there's lots of you, why you do as well. And maybe someday in the future, I'll come back and finally see what makes this game a masterpiece to so many.